Looking back. If we shadows have offended, think but this, and all is mended, that you but slumbered here, while these visions did appear. William Shakespeare, A Midsummer's Night Dream. It is July 2009, and now we see that it is over, and all revealed, and is a stark reality. Having slumbered for 40 years, those long-abandoned artifacts lying silent on the moon landing sites are now seen in detail. NASA have used the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter to take high-resolution photographs of the Apollo landing sites. Launched on 18th June 2009, the LRO orbited the Moon at a height of 50 kilometers above the lunar surface, and it is said to have provided images with a resolution down to about 18 inches. For a short time in 2011, they brought the LRO down to a mere 25 kilometers above the lunar surface to specifically photograph the Apollo landing sites in greater detail. NASA have published the LRO photographs of the Apollo 12, 14, and 17 landing sites, and in these photographs, NASA have identified the location of the artifacts they left on the Moon, plus the footprint trails left by the astronauts, and the tire tracks left by the lunar rover used on Apollo 17. Everything we expect to see is there, albeit in somewhat grainy black and white, but according to NASA, they are there nonetheless. So now we can see that it was all true, man did walk on the Moon, so no more questions and no more hoax stories from the skeptics. I am feeling somewhat embarrassed now that I have wasted your valuable time, as I could have told you this at the very beginning. Our believers can only but rejoice their glee and watch our skeptics scurry away hanging their heads in undoubted shame. Amy Title from Vintage Space happily reports the good news. Our staunch believer Astrobrant 2 also has a contribution with his proof of the moon landings. More believers are waiting in line to jubilate at this new evidence. Gone to Plaid can now show us stereoscopic views of the landing sites. Finally, here we have Bruce RFID, who quite convincingly matches the LRO photos to the panoramas. I could go on and on showing the glee of the believers. As I said, there is a veritable queue, including believer DataCube, who presents his evidence that the moon landings were definitely not fake. In this video, he asserts that both the Indian Trajan and the Chinese satellite Chang'e 2 took photographs of the Apollo landing sites, but presents no evidence for this assertion. I have been totally unable to find any reference to this, so I am extremely doubtful of its verdict. Let us end the celebrations with this offering from astronaut Neil Armstrong himself, as he narrates his own landing on the Moon with Apollo 11. In fact, this is a very slick video. So happily I can put down my pen and go tend my long-neglected garden. At last, this must be the end of the saga, and you dear viewers can move on to better things. You may naturally be pondering, if all was revealed in 2009, then why did I even start to write this video series in 2018? We now have total proof that the Apollo moon landings were true, so it is all over, as we say, done and dusted. Or is it? Like everything in this long-running and seemingly never-ending tale, it may not finally close the book on this subject. Not so fast, appeal the skeptics. They contend that there is something rather strange about these LRO photographs, and all may not be as described by NASA. So let us pause a while before we head for the hills and listen to what our skeptics have to say. Finally, just some background on why it has taken so long to view the Apollo landing sites. The Apollo missions took place between 1969 and 1972, so you may well wonder, why have we not been able to see the landing sites before 2009? We seem to have telescopes that are able to peer far out into deep space and produce wonderfully detailed images of far-off galaxies. We also have the Hubble Space Telescope. Surely that could have been focused on the moon and photographed the landing sites. Well, apparently not, as Amy Title has just taken the trouble to explain. In order to get some idea of the scale of what we are looking for, we can use the telescope of amateur astronomer Marco Alt as he zooms and zooms and zooms into the Apollo 11 landing site. You can see that it is the proverbial needle in the haystack, quite a tiny area, with even tinier artifacts to resolve. So we needed to wait until NASA launched the LRO in 2009 in order to resolve the detail of the landing sites. What does skeptic Jera White think of this new photography? Well, quite honestly, not much, as he explains. Jarrah looks at the GOI reconnaissance satellite, which resides at an altitude of 681 kilometers above the Earth and has virtually the same resolution as the camera used on the LRO. The GOI produced detailed images from a height 12 times higher than that of the LRO, and it can clearly resolve quite small objects such as cars and even people. So Jarrah maintains that there is something suspicious about the LRO photographs given the disappointing level of resolution. We may also consider that Google Earth makes use of the satellite named QuickBird, which makes a polar orbit every 90 minutes at a height of between 250 and 300 miles. This provides a resolution in which each pixel covers an area on the ground about 1 square foot, which allows you, for example, to clearly see a car, a person, or even a dog. So we may well ask, why does the LRO cameras produce such poor resolution and barely distinguishable photographs? Our skeptics are keen to point out that without the large annotations placed on the photography used by NASA, then they would struggle to understand what they are looking at. In August 2010, NASA announced that the LRO would dip from its usual 50 kilometers to only 25 kilometers altitude above the Apollo landing sites to provide more detailed high-resolution images. Finally, we hope to get the detail in the photographs that we expected in the beginning. Jarrah White shows his disappointment with the supposed better resolution images in that the 25-kilometer photographs are barely undistinguishable from those previously taken at 50 kilometers, and we still need to take NASA's word for what we are seeing. Jarrah White is not alone in his disappointment, as Mr. Sandpit123 explains in his contribution. As we might expect, our skeptic Hunchbacked also has his own view on the LRO photographs and likewise is not all convinced. He compares the detail of the satellite photographs with the photographs taken on the moon's surface during the Apollo missions. He goes even further in his attempt to prove that the LRO images are in fact just fakes. In this video, he first emphasizes that the image has been photoshopped. I am not sure how relevant this is given that we know NASA did alter the photographs to add to the annotations unless he is referring to the unannotated photographs, but he fails to make this clear. More on this matter later. He makes certain calculations of the distance between the lander and the LSEP, Apollo Lunar Surface Experiments package, using evidence from the photographs and original coordinates from NASA for the location of the sites. He finds significant discrepancies in the distances, which he believes proves that the photographs must have been faked. If he is referring to the unannotated photographs, then there is no real reason why a digital image should have been photoshopped, but perhaps NASA innocently cleaned up some of the defects in the image, or, as the skeptics would have you believe, added slightly more detail. Having given NASA the benefit of the doubt in this case about any photoshopping of the image, I am afraid that we will later present incontestable proof that NASA does create completely false images that it claims to be from the LRO. What about the footprints and the tire tracks so clearly identified by the NASA LRO photographs? Our skeptic Jarrah White has a detailed look at the problem but remains totally unimpressed. In this video, he tries to reconstruct what the footprints should look like on the LRO photographs, but with little success. Jarrah takes a more detailed look at the trails of the LRO photographs, in particular what he sees to be dead ends to the trails. He compares a broad image of the Apollo 17 landing site taken from the Arizona State University video, which shows a far wider area of the very small LRO area shown in the NASA photographs. His investigation notes that the boot and the tire track end at the periphery of the LRO photograph and do not continue outside this area. The implication is that the tracks have been drawn onto the LRO photographs, but the wider area photograph has not been so doctored. This is a significant discovery and needs to be explained. As we might expect, our believer Astrobrant 2 has something to say on Jarrah White's problem with the tracks on the LRO photographs. He points out that Jarrah basically admitted in this video that the resolution of the LRO photographs makes them hardly worth analyzing. However, Jarrah's point that the tracks disappear outside the limited range of the LRO photograph does seem quite relevant, but is not mentioned in Astrobrant 2's contribution. I can assure you that there is a wealth of discussion on the LRO photographs, but most centers on whether the photographs have been doctored by NASA to prove a point or are genuine original photographs from the LRO. I mentioned above that NASA have doctored some of the LRO photographs, and here is the proof in this video by Paul on the Plane, in which he shows clear evidence that NASA has faked some of the LRO photographs. In this video, he examines several photographs of the Earthrise supposedly taken by the LRO whilst orbiting the Moon. By manipulating the brightness and the contrast, he shows quite clearly that the Earth has been superimposed in all of the photographs. This video is the first part of a 4-part series, but watching this first one is enough to understand his point. There seems to be no doubt that these photographs have been doctored, and it invites you to ask, why did NASA need to do this? Was it perhaps because they had no genuine photographs? The evidence from the Chinese exploration of the Moon using their own satellites is reported to have been found no trace of any activity at the supposed locations of the Apollo landing sites, according to this CNN report. I have been unable to confirm whether this video is genuine or an elaborate voiceover hoax. It seems as though Bertie Slack has the answer to this report, as he examines the background to this story and concludes that it is just another fake news item. We have further evidence that NASA photoshopped the LRO photographs in this interesting contribution from Deborah Malmedy. Interestingly, Deborah believes that NASA did land men on the Moon, but she has serious doubts about some of the aspects of the Apollo missions. Although she believes that NASA did succeed with the Moon landings, she believes that the footage of the astronauts on the Moon was probably faked. A new and interesting point of view, but unfortunately she bases her belief on the shadows misnomer that we discussed exhaustively in video 13. Like others, Deborah was extremely disappointed at the quality of the LRO images, having been led to believe from the NASA hype that the images would be high resolution. She makes a very valid point that she fails to see in these LRO images the significant advantages made over the past 40 years in digital photography. On the question of NASA photoshopping the LRO images, she refers to a video by Hunchbacked, which clearly shows that NASA did probably Photoshop even the raw LRO images. However, the telltale Adobe Duck in the file header can also be produced if the photograph has been compressed to a lower resolution, as we have previously discussed. In the remainder of the video, she recounts the normal anomalies discussed elsewhere in this video concerning the evidence for and against the Apollo moon landings. NASA no-fly zones. Before we head out of this chapter of this video, there is one very pertinent further point to make concerning the Apollo landing sites. At the very end of Jerry White's video, he makes mention of the NASA no-fly zones. He continues with his story in the follow-up video part 2. He discusses the possibility that the Apollo landing site may in future be visible using high-powered Earth-based telescopes. We can only wait and hope. It transpires that in July 2011, NASA released a paper, Recommendations to Spacefaring Entities, How to Protect and Preserve the Historic and Scientific Value of the U.S. Government Lunar Artifacts. This paper, shown in full, consisting of a full 93 pages, states, "This document, dated July 20th, 2011, contains the NASA recommendations and associated rationale for spacecraft planning to visit U.S. heritage lunar sites." NASA states that the legal framework for this document is, the USG, United States Government, continues to maintain ownership of NASA hardware and other property on the surface of the Moon, including the Apollo artifacts. These recommendations are not legal requirements, rather they are technical recommendations for consideration by interested entities. NASA seeks coordination in advance of lunar activities that would impact NASA artifacts of historic and scientific interest to ensure that all appropriate interests are recognized and protected. NASA recognizes that these recommendations would evolve and welcomes the opportunity to work with foreign space agencies and other entities planning robotic lunar missions. The paper outlines specific areas, including approach paths, which would not be violated as they contain historical artifacts. It contains guidelines to protect Apollo 11 and 17 landing sites, listing them as off-limits, and includes close proximity limits to ground travel and no-fly zones to avoid spraying rocket exhaust or dust onto aging but historical equipment. Robert Kelso, NASA's Director of Lunar Commercial Services at Johnson Space Center in Houston, has taken a hard look at future revisits to the Apollo sites and how to protect U.S. government artifacts on the Moon. Kelso has carved out a set of guidelines intended to safeguard the historic and scientific value of more than 36 heritage sites on the lunar surface. This was reported on the YouTube channel Sky News, which sets out the main concerns that NASA have for preservation of the Apollo moon landing sites. A greater urgency for guidelines has been sparked by the Google Lunar X Prizes offer of US $20 million to any private team that lands a robotic rover on the moon's surface. An additional US $4 million has been offered for any team that snaps pictures of artifacts near or at the Apollo landing sites. For Kelso, a key question is, as the small commercial landers make preparations for possible visits to these historic sites, how do we protect these culturally significant sites from the damage so that we can inspect them historically and scientifically? The recommendations listed by NASA are intended to apply to U.S. government artifacts on the lunar surface, such as 1. Apollo lunar surface landing and rover hardware, 2. Unmanned lunar surface landing sites, example, Surveyor robot landing sites, and impact sites such as those of the NASA Ranger spacecraft, as well as the Lunar Crater Observation and Sensing Satellite, LC-ROSS, that slammed into the Moon in October 2009. 3. U.S. government experiments left on the lunar surface, tools, equipment, and miscellaneous moonwalk gear, and 4. Specific indicators of U.S. human-robotic lunar lander presence, including footprints and lunar rover tracks. Beth O'Leary, an anthropology professor at New Mexico State University, said that the NASA guidelines create a series of keep-out zones and boundaries around the historic artifacts and historic features at all Apollo landing sites. Apollo 11 and 17 are acknowledged as having special historical and cultural significance, she said. Those two locales are treated as unique by prohibiting any visits to parts of these sites, and all future visiting vehicles would remain beyond the artifact boundaries of each entire site. This provides a robust zone of protection around these two sites. For me, the NASA document represents a giant leap for lunar historic preservation. NASA references its ownership of its lunar hardware and the need for protecting what it calls witness plates, or lunar assets, those significant artifacts it created in the past that are now on the Moon. This is a critical first step, and many more have to follow, but for the first time, NASA formally recognizes the heritage value of Apollo 11 and other extraordinary lunar sites. Importantly, it recognizes that future missions can disturb or change the earlier lunar landing sites in ways that scientific and historical information can be lost. Also, some of the other sites are still active and continue to provide data, such as Apollo retroreflectors used to measure the distance between Earth and Moon via laser ranging. NASA takes pains to explain that it is only doing this to protect astronauts' discarded food and feces. The argument itself is specious. The real purpose of the no-fly zones, alleged by some skeptics, is to dissuade upcoming lunar missions by other countries, including Japan, India, and China, from spilling the beans on what is really up there. It is somewhat unbelievable to comprehend how the United States, with absolutely no space fleet, can impose no-fly zones on the Moon. But let's assume for a moment that they could impose their will. Why would they? The key question is, are they trying to keep something secret? The U.S. government claims that NASA's recommendations for no-fly zones are for preserving and protecting Apollo missions' historical sites and artifacts. Apollo 11 and 17 sites will remain off-limits with ground travel buffers of 75 meters and 225 meters from each lunar lander. When I first encountered this news of no-fly zones, I searched for what I imagined would be a numerous protest from our merry bunch of skeptics claiming that NASA had something to hide, but surprisingly there is almost nothing except the contribution by Jera White. I did find this contribution from Luvian, who questions the timing of the announcement given that there had already been several previous moon-exploring satellites from China and India. There is one more comment on the NASA no-fly zones from Jera White, who notes that, so far, the only orbiting satellites capable of resolving detailed images was NASA's LRO. He mentions that the company, Astrobotic Technology, which is a US private company, had plans in 2011 to launch a moon rover using the SpaceX launch vehicle, but as yet, nothing has materialized. Perhaps it is no coincidence that shortly after the Astrobotic Technology announcement that NASA implemented its directive for no-fly zones. Deja vu, Orion. We make guilty of our disasters the sun, the moon, and stars, as if we were villains unnecessarily, fools by heavenly compulsion. William Shakespeare, King Lear. Hey, wake up! We are going again. Hope you kept that old spacesuit. I have still got mine. So, don on your helmets, we are off, not to the moon this time, but believe it or not, to Mars. A human mission to Mars has been the stuff of science fiction ever since my childhood, and I guess even before that. You may question why we are discussing holidays on Mars in a video supposedly about the moon. This relates to several of the anomalies in the Apollo story which our skeptics have called into question. Perhaps the most important of these anomalies for the skeptics was the radiation dangers in the Van Allen belts and beyond. Trying to understand how NASA and the other worldwide agencies are attempting to deal with radiation now may provide some insight into the Apollo radiation dilemma. We discussed radiation in detail in Video 6, Too Hot to Handle. Safely passing through the Van Allen radiation belts, known to contain regions of extremely high radiation, was a major contention of our skeptics, and seemingly an easily explained problem for our believers. Our skeptics voiced concerns about the shielding of the spacecraft from radiation by what was in effect a few layers of kitchen foil and the protection of the astronauts in their suits on the moon from harmful cosmic particles. The only people to ever cross this possibly potentially dangerous radiation region of space were the Apollo astronauts on their journey to the moon between 1969 and 1972. That was 50 years ago. All of the astronauts have remained safely within inner Earth orbit, well protected by the Earth's paternal magnetosphere. We can only imagine that there has been much more detailed research into this subject of radiation, more scientific data collection, and new developments in radiation protection since then. So it seems pertinent that we look at what NASA are now saying about this problem in connection with their newly proposed manned space ventures outside of inner Earth orbit. This may not necessarily answer our skeptics' dilemma, but perhaps help to understand it better. Project Orion. NASA has now embarked on a new series of space missions code-named Project Orion for interplanetary space exploration. It is intended that Orion will carry astronauts into deep space and then, fingers crossed, will return them safely home to Earth. It is claimed that Orion will be able to travel to asteroids, to the Moon, or even to Mars. To accomplish this, NASA has developed a huge rocket called Space Launch System, which utilizes the Delta IV Heavy rocket. At launch, the Orion spacecraft will sit on top of this rocket. The heavy lift launch vehicle will carry Orion beyond low Earth orbit, where the International Space Station orbits, and far past the Moon into the outer reaches of our universe. The Orion spacecraft consists of three main parts. The upper section is the Launch Abort System, LAS, the crew module in the middle part, and the service module in the lower portion of the spacecraft. Astronauts will sit in the middle section, the crew module. This will be their living quarters for the likely 9-month journey to Mars. If an emergency occurs during launch, or in the climb into orbit, the LAS would activate in milliseconds. It would propel the crew module away from the rocket, hopefully to safety. The LAS looks like a communications tower situated on top of the crew module. Beneath the crew module is the service module. It holds the power and propulsion systems. The solar array panels on the service module will absorb sunlight to create electricity. This solar power will allow the spacecraft to remain in orbit for a few months at a time. A more detailed look at the Orion spacecraft is shown in this video above, and the detailed view of the actual Orion space capsule is also shown in this video from Lockheed Martin. When you view these videos, there is not much to mention of the hazards of radiation on passing through the Van Allen belts and into deep space. Not surprisingly, NASA has been developing spacesuits for more than 50 years, and a new version for the Orion astronauts has been developed. Again, a little said about radiation apart from the spacesuit must protect against radiation, but they provide no detail of how this will be accomplished. If you recall, our skeptics have identified radiation as being one of the biggest hurdles to leaving inner Earth orbit, so one would have expected more detail from NASA. It is proposed, for reasons not explained, that the new spacesuit will also be internet connected. What next? Do we have internet on Mars already while I am still struggling to get a decent connection here on terra firma? Following several years of development, the SLS using the Delta IV Heavy rocket, Orion has now successfully tested and proved to perform as expected. NASA has also produced a slick video, Orion Trial by Fire, to introduce Orion, which is narrated by NASA engineer Kelly Smith. Now again starts the controversy for our skeptics. In this video, Kelly Smith narrates the journey on Orion and makes the statement,
"As we get further away from Earth, we'll pass through the Van Allen belts, an area of dangerous radiation. Radiation like this could harm the guidance systems, onboard computers, or other electronics on Orion. Naturally, we have to pass through this danger zone twice, once up and once back. But Orion has protection. Shielding will be put to the test as the vehicle cuts through the waves of radiation. Sensors aboard will record radiation levels for scientists to study. We must solve these challenges before we send people through this region of space. For this flight, it's time to head home."
It is that last sentence which has our skeptics up in arms again. Remember, one of the most repeatedly voiced reasons for doubting the moon landings was the impossibility of safely passing through the Van Allen radiation belts. This video by Hallelujah Girl is typical of many of the skeptics. She makes the point that back in 1969, we sent the Apollo astronauts through the Van Allen radiation belts with apparently no significant shielding, and they were fine, no reported problems. You may also recall that astronaut Alan Bean didn't even know that he had passed through this area of dangerous radiation. Apparently, according to NASA, the astronauts received a minimal dose of radiation for the whole moon missions, which were only equivalent to 2 CT body scans. We have quite a few other videos from the skeptics in this same vein, and it is a logical question, why can't they use similar technology that was used in 1969, which apparently proved so successful? This argument by the skeptics that NASA has done it already, so why doubts now is challenged by believer Greater Sapien. I have watched this video several times and I still do not follow what he is trying to say. I am not the only one with a problem understanding the logic of this video, as the skeptic Richard Lionheart explains. Finally, we have some quantitative information on radiation by believer Curious Droid. He explains in his usual clear and informed manner how dangerous a mission to Mars might be for the astronauts, and he makes a very valid point that robotic missions could in fact be more useful than manned missions. Quantitative figures were obtained from the Radiation Assessment Detector instrument, which was on board the Mars Curiosity rover launched in November 2011. The measurements from the Mars Curiosity rover indicate that deep space radiation levels may vary from 100 times to 1,000 times the levels we experience here on Earth for an unshielded occupant. The variation in these levels is explained by the rise and fall of solar activity. Curious Droid points out that the latest research shows that plastics are better at shielding from radiation than the aluminum that was used on Apollo, and this has been incorporated into the design of the Orion and the SpaceX Dragon 2 spacecrafts. In summary, using the data from the Mars Curiosity rover radiation assessment detector, the calculated radiation risk of a return journey to Mars is equivalent to 50 full-body CT scans, or 30 times the yearly allowance for the UK Department of Environment radiation worker. So, how dangerous is a CT scan? Well, scientists say that a full-body CT scan packs a megadose of radiation equivalent to about 500 times that of a conventional X-ray. So on this basis, astronauts would return from Mars having had the equivalent of 25,000 X-rays over, say, a 2-year period, which is more than a shocking 34 X-rays a day, and that doesn't include whatever time they stay on Mars. The skeptics helpfully point out that you may recognize them as the guys with the blue glow. The important fact to remember is that radiation is cumulative in that it builds up in the body. If the exposure happens faster than the body can repair itself, then you face serious problems. I have not been able to determine what 34 X-rays a day means in terms of astronaut survival, but it does not sound altogether too healthy. The problem is that nobody is telling us what the figures are, or perhaps nobody in the space race really knows. If that is the case, then they should not be so eager to send astronauts above inner Earth orbit until they are fully conversant with the likely risks.